They said she didn't belong on her own jet, and in that single sentence, everything about power, perception, and prejudice began to quietly unravel. At exactly 6:42 a.m. at a private aviation terminal outside Dallas, Texas, a woman in a simple dark coat and minimal luggage stood at the base of a white private jet stairs, her expression calm in a way that unsettled people more than emotion ever could. Her name was Victoria Hayes, though no one on the tarmac seemed interested in asking for it properly. To the crew preparing the aircraft, she was just another early arrival, another passenger who did not match the expectations built into their assumptions. The aircraft belonged to Hayes Aviation Group, a fleet operated under strict executive access protocols, but none of that seemed to matter in the first few seconds of judgment. First Officer Mark Reynolds stepped forward, clipboard in hand, scanning her from a distance before his attention settled on her boarding pass with mild skepticism. Beside him, Senior Cabin Lead Sophie Carter adjusted her gloves, her tone precise but detached as she observed Victoria's appearance, as if evaluating whether she fit into a space already decided without her input. "I think there's been a mistake," Sophie said, her voice controlled but firm, gesturing subtly toward the aircraft door. Victoria didn't respond immediately. She simply looked past them, toward the cabin entrance where her name was already registered in the system they were standing inside of, but not fully seeing. Behind the tinted glass of the jet, lights flickered softly as final pre-departure checks continued, unaware of the tension forming outside. Mark exhaled slowly, lowering his clipboard just enough to signal a conclusion forming in his mind. "This aircraft is reserved for verified passengers and executive clearance only," he added, as if reading from a rule that needed no further interpretation. Victoria nodded once, almost as if acknowledging the statement rather than accepting it, and that silence created a discomfort that neither of them could immediately name. A ground staff member nearby hesitated, glancing at a tablet, where a line of text briefly displayed an internal designation tied to ownership-level access, but the moment passed before it could be voiced. Sophie took a small step closer, her professionalism tightening into something more rigid. "Ma'am, if you're here for charter service, you'll need to check in at the main terminal." The words were polite, but the meaning behind them was not. Victoria finally spoke, her voice steady, low, without urgency. "I am already where I need to be." The air between them shifted slightly, not through volume or confrontation, but through certainty that had not yet been recognized as authority. Mark exchanged a glance with Sophie, the kind of silent communication that happens when people believe they are protecting order from disruption. The jet door remained open behind them, waiting, unaware that the definition of who belonged inside it was about to be questioned in ways no checklist could contain. The moment Victoria Hayes finished speaking, the space around the aircraft felt subtly different, as if the air itself had adjusted to a truth that had not yet been acknowledged. First Officer Mark Reynolds tightened his grip on the clipboard, his eyes narrowing slightly as he rechecked the passenger manifest on his tablet, expecting clarification that would restore order to his assumptions. Beside him, Senior Cabin Lead Sophie Carter shifted her stance, maintaining professionalism, yet now carrying a sharper edge in her tone. "I understand there may be some confusion," she said, carefully choosing her words, "but this aircraft is operating under confirmed executive clearance. We do not have any record of your boarding authorization under this departure sequence." Victoria did not react immediately. Instead, she looked toward the open cabin door again, where the interior lighting reflected softly against polished surfaces, a space designed for precision, exclusivity, and control. Somewhere inside that system, her name existed in full legal alignment with ownership records, but that reality had not yet reached the people standing in front of her. A ground systems technician nearby glanced at his handheld device again, hesitating as a line of data briefly populated. With an override tag labeled Hayes Aviation Executive Control, but he looked away before speaking, uncertain whether he was interpreting it correctly or overstepping protocol. Mark stepped slightly forward, lowering his voice in a controlled but firm manner. "If you are attempting to board through charter misunderstanding, we can reassign you to ground support for rebooking. However, this aircraft is preparing for departure in less than 20 minutes, and we need to maintain schedule integrity." His tone suggested closure, as if the conversation had already reached its logical endpoint. Sophie nodded once in agreement, adding, "We simply cannot permit unauthorized access to a restricted cabin environment." Victoria finally turned her attention fully back to them. There was no visible irritation, no escalation, only a steady presence that made their certainty begin to feel slightly rehearsed rather than absolute. "You are correct about one thing," she said calmly. "This aircraft is preparing for departure." A pause followed, quiet enough that even the distant hum of ground operations seemed to fade. She continued, "But your understanding of authorization is incomplete." Mark exhaled softly, exchanging a brief glance with Sophie, both interpreting her words as resistance rather than clarification. Sophie reached for her communication device, preparing to escalate the situation according to protocol, while Mark straightened his posture, signaling readiness to involve ground security verification if necessary. At that moment, a notification briefly appeared on Sophie's tablet screen showing system synchronization with executive override credentials, but before she could fully register it, the display refreshed back to standard passenger view. Victoria observed the subtle reaction in their movements, the hesitation that followed something they did not fully understand. The aircraft door remained open behind them, cabin lights steady, engines quietly preparing, unaware that the definition of who had the right to step inside was about to be corrected at the system level rather than the human one. The hesitation in the air stretched longer than anyone expected, not because anyone moved, but because certainty itself had begun to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. First Officer Mark Reynolds looked down at his tablet again, refreshing the passenger manifest with a slightly firmer motion, as if repetition could correct interpretation. The screen responded instantly, yet what appeared did not match his expectations. A second line of clearance data briefly surfaced beneath Victoria Hayes's name, labeled Executive Ownership Authorization Active, before the interface automatically minimized it back into standard passenger formatting. Sophie Carter noticed his pause and leaned in slightly, her voice still controlled, but now carrying a sharper edge of concern. "Is there an issue with the system?" she asked, though her tone suggested she expected the answer to reinforce her current understanding. Mark hesitated for less than a second before responding. "It appears to be a temporary synchronization delay." The explanation was delivered quickly, almost reflexively, as if protecting procedural confidence mattered more than interrogating uncertainty. Victoria Hayes remained still, her gaze not fixed on either of them, but rather on the aircraft itself, as though listening to something they could not yet hear. A ground operations coordinator nearby shifted uneasily, glancing between his tablet and the aircraft door, where internal status lights indicated full readiness for departure clearance. He took a step forward, then stopped, conflicted between protocol hierarchy and what he was beginning to see displayed in fragments across multiple systems. Sophie adjusted her stance again, attempting to regain control of the interaction. "Ma'am, I need to ask you one final time to confirm your booking reference and identity verification channel," she said, her voice now more direct, shaped by procedure rather than assumption. Victoria finally turned her attention back to her. The silence before her response was not empty, but deliberate, as if she was measuring how much longer this misunderstanding would be allowed to exist. "You are asking the wrong question," she said calmly. Sophie frowned slightly, her professionalism tightening into caution. "I am asking for verification required for boarding clearance." Victoria nodded once, acknowledging the structure of the question without accepting its premise. "And I am telling you that verification has already been completed at a level above your access threshold." The words did not rise in volume, but they changed the texture of the moment. Mark shifted his weight subtly, glancing toward the aircraft entry point where a faint internal notification pulse appeared again on his device, this time more persistent, briefly locking his interface before releasing it. Sophie noticed it too, her eyes narrowing as the system flickered for a fraction of a second into a restricted ownership layer before reverting. Neither of them spoke immediately after that. The wind on the tarmac moved lightly across the ground crew uniforms, but even that ordinary motion felt slower, as if the environment itself was waiting for a decision no one had formally announced. Victoria Hayes finally took a small step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward alignment with the aircraft stairs, her presence steady and unhurried. "You may continue operating under your current assumption," she said quietly. But it will not change what is already true. And for the first time, neither Mark nor Sophie responded, because the system they trusted was beginning to acknowledge something they had not yet accepted. The moment stretched into something no one on the tarmac could comfortably define anymore, because what had started as a routine boarding verification was now behaving like a system that no longer agreed with the people operating it. First Officer Mark Reynolds stared at his tablet longer than necessary, his thumb hovering over the refresh icon, as if hesitation might produce clarity. The data did refresh, but this time the change was undeniable. A full executive ownership confirmation line appeared beneath Victoria Hayes's profile, marked with priority clearance status and aircraft command authorization. For a brief second, the information remained stable, long enough that it could not be dismissed as a glitch. Then it shifted again, locking into a deeper system layer that neither Mark nor Sophie Carter had access rights to interpret fully. Sophie's expression tightened as she leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to maintain control while uncertainty crept in. "Mark, what exactly is showing on your screen right now?" she asked. Mark did not answer immediately. His attention was fixed on the words "executive override active," repeated across multiple system modules that were now syncing in real time. The aircraft door remained open behind them, the interior lighting steady and patient, as if unaffected by the human hesitation unfolding outside. Victoria Hayes stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence not demanding attention but making avoidance increasingly difficult. A ground systems supervisor stepped closer from the side, holding a secondary device that mirrored Mark's display. His eyes moved quickly across the screen, then paused on a verification chain that traced ownership authority through Hayes Aviation Group Corporate Aviation Registry. He exhaled quietly, not speaking, as if confirming something he was not yet ready to verbalize. Sophie finally turned back toward Victoria, her tone shifting slightly, still professional but no longer fully anchored in certainty. "There appears to be an internal system update in progress," she said carefully. Victoria's response was calm, measured, and without urgency. "There is no update," she said. "There is only recognition." The words hung in the space between them, not as confrontation, but as correction. Mark lowered his tablet slightly, glancing toward Sophie, then back at the aircraft entry, where access lights briefly changed from standard boarding readiness to restricted executive confirmation before stabilizing again. The shift was subtle, but no longer deniable. Sophie's communication device vibrated once, a soft notification indicating a status escalation from ground operations control. She glanced at it, her expression tightening as she read the line confirming ownership level authorization validated at System Authority Tier 1. For the first time, she did not immediately respond. Instead, she looked at Victoria with a different kind of focus, one that was no longer trying to classify her, but trying to understand what had already been accepted by the system they trusted. The wind moved lightly across the tarmac again, carrying the sound of distant ground activity, but it felt muted now, as if the environment itself had stepped back to observe. Victoria Hayes finally shifted her gaze toward the aircraft stairs. She did not rush, did not hesitate, and did not ask for permission. She simply began to move forward, one step at a time, as the system quietly aligned itself behind her in silence that no one present could ignore anymore. Victoria Hayes reached the first step of the aircraft stairs at a steady pace, each movement controlled, deliberate, and unaffected by the shifting uncertainty behind her. The open cabin door above reflected soft white light onto the polished metal steps, creating a quiet contrast against the tension still lingering on the tarmac. Behind her, First Officer Mark Reynolds lowered his tablet slightly, his posture no longer fully aligned with procedural confidence, as the system continued to display layered authorization states that contradicted his earlier assumptions. Sophie Carter stood frozen for a fraction longer than she intended, her eyes tracking Victoria's movement upward, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been trained to expect. A ground systems notification chimed softly from multiple devices at once, signaling a synchronized update across aviation clearance channels. Mark glanced down again, and this time there was no delay in the information. The aircraft was now fully assigned under executive ownership control, with boarding authority automatically reassigned to the verified owner profile currently ascending the stairs. Sophie's breathing remained controlled, but her expression had shifted into something quieter, less certain, as she slowly lowered her communication device without issuing the escalation command she had prepared moments earlier. Victoria paused briefly on the second step, not turning around, not acknowledging the hesitation behind her, but speaking just loudly enough for her words to carry in the open air between them. "You were never wrong to follow procedure," she said calmly. "But procedure only works when it recognizes the full truth." Mark's eyes flicked upward from his screen toward her, but he did not respond. The statement was not delivered as accusation, but as final clarification. Behind him, Sophie finally looked down at her tablet again, where the system now displayed a complete ownership validation chain, tracing authority through Hayes Aviation Group Executive Command Infrastructure, confirmed and active. The aircraft entry system emitted a soft confirmation tone, signaling that all boarding restrictions had been removed. The open door, once a point of verification, now stood as a passive threshold awaiting authorization that had already been fulfilled. Victoria resumed her ascent, reaching the upper steps where the cabin interior became fully visible, rows of seats aligned in quiet symmetry, untouched and ready. The lighting inside the jet reflected across her face, not changing her expression, only revealing how steady it had been all along. Mark stepped slightly to the side without being instructed, his movement subtle but deliberate, as if acknowledging a shift in position that no longer required his approval. Sophie remained still, watching as Victoria approached the threshold, her presence now no longer questioned by any system or person within immediate range. A final notification appeared briefly on all ground crew devices, confirming full transfer of operational authority to onboard executive command. The aircraft was no longer waiting for permission to proceed. It was waiting only for its owner to decide that it would. Victoria Hayes stepped fully into the aircraft cabin, and the atmosphere inside shifted in a way that was not visible but deeply felt, like a system finally aligning with a command it had been waiting to recognize. The soft interior lighting reflected off polished surfaces, casting a calm, controlled brightness across rows of empty seats, while outside the open door, the ground crew remained still in a state of unresolved transition. First Officer Mark Reynolds stood just outside the threshold now, no longer attempting to interpret the situation through assumptions, but still processing the verified authorization chain that had replaced every earlier certainty he held. His tablet remained in his hand, though he no longer relied on it for direction. Sophie Carter followed just behind him in posture only, not movement, her attention fixed on Victoria as she moved further into the cabin without hesitation or need for acknowledgement. Inside the aircraft, Victoria paused near the center aisle, her presence no longer disruptive, but fully integrated into the space as if it had been designed around her from the beginning. A soft notification tone echoed through the aircraft internal system, confirming final synchronization of executive command authority with onboard operations. Mark heard it from the doorway and looked down instinctively, where a final line of text confirmed that all flight control permissions had been reassigned to Hayes Aviation Executive Ownership Protocol. Sophie exhaled slowly, her earlier certainty now replaced with a quieter recognition that the structure she had been enforcing no longer applied in the way she had believed. Victoria turned slightly, not toward them specifically, but toward the aircraft interior as a whole, as if addressing a space that had already begun responding to her presence. "You can proceed with standard departure preparation," she said calmly, her voice steady and uninterrupted by any remaining uncertainty. The words were not instruction in the traditional sense, but confirmation of continuity. Mark nodded once without speaking, stepping slightly back from the doorway, as if acknowledging that his role in this moment had transitioned from gatekeeper to observer. Sophie remained near the entrance, her eyes briefly scanning the cabin controls where executive authorization indicators now displayed full green status across all operational systems. A ground coordination alert confirmed that the flight plan had been automatically validated under owner override, removing all remaining procedural holds. The aircraft door remained open, but the distinction between inside and outside no longer carried the same meaning it had minutes earlier. Victoria moved slowly down the aisle, her steps unhurried, passing rows that were now simply part of her environment rather than a space requiring permission. She placed her hand lightly on the back of one seat as she passed, not as ownership being claimed, but as familiarity being acknowledged. Behind her, Mark finally lowered his tablet completely, holding it at his side without further input, while Sophie took one final look at the system display before turning her attention fully to the interior of the cabin. The aircraft was now in a fully active executive state, cleared for departure under sole authority control, with all previous restrictions dissolved into final confirmation. Victoria reached her designated position near the front of the cabin and paused, looking forward through the cockpit doorway where the final systems were now awaiting only a single command sequence. The environment was no longer uncertain, no longer contested, and no longer divided by assumption. It was simply aligned, waiting, and fully aware of who had already arrived. The cabin was no longer operating as a space of uncertainty, but as a controlled environment waiting for final acknowledgement. And in that stillness, Victoria Hayes remained seated near the front section of the aircraft with a calmness that did not request attention but naturally commanded it. Outside the cockpit doorway, the final status indicator turned steady green across all systems, confirming full executive control authorization active without restriction. First Officer Mark Reynolds stood just inside the threshold, his earlier assumptions now fully replaced by verified system confirmation logs that he could no longer reinterpret as error or delay. Senior Cabin Lead Sophie Carter remained near the entry point, her posture unchanged, but her perception fundamentally shifted as she reviewed the final ownership verification line displayed across the aircraft interface, clearly stating executive authority assigned to Hayes Aviation Group primary ownership profile. A soft internal communication tone echoed through the cabin system, signaling that ground control had completed synchronization with onboard command hierarchy. Mark did not move for several seconds, his attention fixed on Victoria as if trying to reconcile the gap between initial judgment and confirmed reality. Sophie finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, stripped of earlier certainty and replaced with procedural acknowledgement. All systems are showing final authorization status confirmed, she said, though the words felt less like information and more like acceptance. Victoria did not turn immediately. Instead, she looked forward through the aircraft toward the cockpit, where flight readiness indicators now displayed full departure clearance under single-entity command. Then proceed accordingly, she said calmly, her voice carrying without force but with unmistakable finality. Mark nodded once, this time without hesitation or attempt to reinterpret the instruction, and stepped slightly aside as if aligning himself with a structure that had corrected itself beyond human input. Sophie lowered her communication device completely, no longer engaging with secondary confirmation channels, as every system she had relied upon had already resolved into a single truth. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt different not because anything physical had changed, but because every layer of assumption had been removed one by one until only verified reality remained. Victoria stood and moved slowly down the aisle toward the cockpit entrance, her presence no longer interpreted through external labels or expectations. Each step she took was matched by silent system confirmations updating in real time across the aircraft network, reflecting full executive command synchronization. Mark and Sophie both observed without speaking as she passed, not out of hesitation now, but out of recognition that no further clarification was required. When Victoria reached the forward cabin threshold, she paused briefly and looked toward the flight controls through the open cockpit doorway, where all indicators now displayed uninterrupted green authorization status tied directly to her profile. Her voice remained steady as she finally spoke the words that settled the last remaining ambiguity in the room. This aircraft does not require permission for me to board it, she said quietly, because it already belongs to me. The statement did not echo, it simply settled, and in that moment every remaining uncertainty dissolved into alignment as Mark lowered his gaze and Sophie stepped slightly back, both understanding that the system they had trusted had not failed, but had simply been waiting for the person it was built to recognize. The cabin remained in a state of quiet alignment, as if every system had settled into its final understanding of authority, And within that silence, Victoria Hayes stood at the front section of the aircraft with a composed stillness that no longer needed explanation. First Officer Mark Reynolds had lowered his tablet entirely now, holding it at his side as he looked toward the cockpit controls that were already reflecting full executive clearance under single ownership command. Senior cabin lead Sophie Carter remained near the entry threshold, her earlier procedural certainty now replaced by silent acknowledgement as she observed the final confirmation logs stabilizing across the aircraft system interface. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, indicating that all pre-departure sequences had transitioned into owner-authorized status, clearing the aircraft for immediate operation under executive directive. No one spoke for several seconds, not because instructions were unclear, but because the structure they had relied on had already completed its correction. Victoria turned slightly toward the cockpit doorway, her presence steady and uninterrupted, as the final system indicators confirmed synchronized control across navigation, cabin, and ground communication layers. Mark finally exhaled, not in relief or resistance, but in recognition of procedural completion, as he stepped fully aside from the doorway, no longer occupying a gatekeeping position that no longer applied. Sophie lowered her gaze briefly to the cabin control panel, where the last remaining advisory flags had disappeared, replaced entirely by a unified executive authorization status tied directly to Victoria Hayes's identity profile. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was no longer defined by uncertainty or hierarchy, conflict, but by resolution that had already been executed at the system level. Victoria took one step forward into the forward cabin space, where the boundary between passenger area and flight control access dissolved into a single continuous environment of ownership and command. Her voice remained calm as she addressed the space ahead, without raising tone or urgency. "Initiate departure sequence when ready," she said, not as instruction seeking approval, but as confirmation that readiness had already been achieved. Mark nodded once, this time without hesitation or interpretation, turning toward the cockpit as the final green indicators confirmed full autonomous clearance under executive authority. Sophie remained still, watching as the interface displayed complete system alignment, every prior restriction replaced by uninterrupted access validation. The aircraft itself now reflected a state of full operational harmony, where every layer of control had converged into a single verified source. Victoria stood at the front of the cabin, looking forward into the cockpit where the final systems awaited execution, not permission. The silence that followed was no longer tension, but completion, as the aircraft prepared to move under the command of the only authority it had been built to recognize. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't need to, because by the time Victoria Hayes stood at the front of the aircraft, every system that once questioned her had already answered itself in silence. The cabin lights held steady, the cockpit displays remained locked in full executive alignment, and the aircraft that had once been a space of doubt now operated under a single uninterrupted authority. First Officer Mark Reynolds remained near the cockpit threshold, no longer attempting to interpret data that had already resolved beyond ambiguity, his posture reflecting a quiet acceptance of procedural reality rather than resistance to it. Senior cabin lead Sophie Carter stood a few feet behind him, her attention no longer searching for inconsistencies in the system, but instead recognizing how quickly certainty had shifted once the correct identity had been fully acknowledged. Outside, the ground crew had fallen into a state of procedural completion, their earlier confusion replaced by synchronized confirmation signals that echoed through their devices in steady intervals. Victoria remained still for a moment at the front of the cabin, looking forward into the cockpit where all flight systems now reflected her authorization without exception or delay. There was no announcement, no dramatic transition, only the final settling of a structure that had corrected itself at every level. The aircraft was no longer reacting to her presence. It was operating in recognition of it. Mark finally spoke in a low, measured tone, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement. "All departure conditions are fully cleared under executive authority," he said, as if confirming something that had already become obvious long before the words were spoken. Sophie lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding that the framework she had enforced was never designed to override what had now been revealed. Victoria turned her head just slightly toward the cockpit, her voice calm, steady, and final. "Then proceed as scheduled," she said, not as permission, but as confirmation that nothing further was required. The cockpit responded immediately through system automation, confirming readiness across all navigation, communication, and control layers, each indicator holding a steady green that no longer fluctuated. Mark stepped fully aside from the threshold, his role in the moment complete, while Sophie remained still, watching the final transition from human interpretation to system execution. The aircraft door began to close smoothly, not rushed, not forced, but aligned with a command sequence that required no further validation. Victoria took her seat at the front of the cabin, her presence no longer interpreted through assumption or exception, but fully integrated into the operational structure that surrounded her. As the engines prepared for final spool up, the cabin remained calm, not because tension had been managed, but because it no longer existed in a system that had resolved all uncertainty at its source. In that final moment before movement, there was no conflict left to observe, only alignment, confirmation, and completion, as the aircraft prepared to depart under the authority it had been built to recognize from the beginning.